Pastor Troy said, hey, why don't you come and do a missions window? I said, I'd love to. And I said, as long as I was there, I would love to share my heart with the people of City View Church. And he said, great, let's have you do that. And then about 2 weeks ago, he sent me an email that said I was assigned Lamatations Chapter 3. And I thought, okay, that's interesting. I've never preached out of Lamentations. And I read the first several verses and I thought, oh my Lord, how does anybody preach out of this? I thought, well, they must have already been doing this 2 weeks, so it won't be fresh by the time we get here. But today we will be preaching out again as the third week of this chapter of definitely not only the most depressing book of the Bible, but maybe one of the most depressing books ever written. But it talks about human despair and anxiety in really incredible ways, and I'm really looking forward to sharing with you this morning. In 2012, I got to visit Auschwitz, Poland. We were in schools, speaking in schools throughout Auschwitz, and I spoke in a church on a Sunday morning, and then we went to Auschwitz, and I was not quite prepared. Now, it's not Disneyland, you're not expecting the tourist trap kind of thing, but I wasn't quite expecting what I would experience when I was there. And Auschwitz I was a military base, and once they outgrew that and outgrew the capacity of the gas chambers, they built Auschwitz II next to it, where they built hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of horse stalls that were meant to keep 12 horses and put 350 people inside of them, where you'd have to go to the bathroom, disease would go, and after a while, they had a situation where they were performing tests. And then one of the things they wanted to know as they instituted slave labor on the Jewish people that were there is how many calories you could survive on while working 12 to 15 hours a day before you died. And as people began to die, they also had another problem. People would come in on the trains every day as more and more people were coming that they didn't have room for. So what they did, and the stage that you're seeing in front of you is a place where I stood, where the trains would end there every day. They would bring out the new concentration camp people that were being sent there. And they decided, okay, 43 people died yesterday, so pick 43 people that will live and send them to the showers, and then pick everybody else, hundreds of people, and send them to the showers that weren't really showers at all. You've seen the movies, you know what those were. Those were gas chambers where people thought they were going to the shower, but they were gassed and their bodies were burned. And there's an incredible book by a man named Elie Wiesel, who wrote a book called Night, where he starts out the book and he says, that I'll never forget my first night in that camp. He was a devout Jew of Romanian heritage. He said, the first night in that camp where I saw the wreaths of smoke that I knew were coming from the bodies of burning children. He said, that night that forever murdered my God. And he tells a story in that book of there was some weapons that were hidden. And when they couldn't figure out, when the Nazi soldiers couldn't figure out who had hidden the weapons, and they couldn't get anybody to give anybody else up, they took a couple of roommates of the people that they thought were, and they brought them up front. They tried to get them to give up the perpetrators. They refused. And so they put about 6 or 7 of those prisoners on that stage that's in the picture there. And they built a gallows there. And when none of them still would give up whoever had the weapons, they kicked the chairs out and they made the entire camp watch as those people struggled for their death. But as they started to walk away, Elie Wiesel explains that one of the young men was too small and they hadn't properly calibrated the fall. And when they kicked out his chair, that young man, his neck didn't break and he struggled. And he said they made us stand there for the next 30 minutes as that young boy, about 10 years old, slowly suffocated to death, hanging from that noose. He said, I stood around with my fellow devout Jews as they said, where is God? Where is God? He said, and in my mind, I pointed at that noose and I said, there he is dead. The depths of human despair can take us to all kinds of places. And one of the amazing things as you read through the book of Lamentations is not just that it is a book that is really, really difficult to take, but it's also the expression coming from a prophet, somebody who was in touch with God, the very voice piece of God, and yet he is expressing things that most of us in our darkest hour would be afraid to express to God. And if you've been here the last couple of weeks, you've probably already heard some of the background, but in case you haven't, the book of Lamentations, each chapter is an acrostic. And it means that each verse and the other 3 chapters are 22 verses each, 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. And I am not an expert in Hebrew by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm told what that means is it's exhaustive, saying our grief is exhaustive, A to Z, nothing left out. So each verse starts. But in Lamentations chapter 3, you go to a triple acrostic where 3 verses at a time are starting with that Hebrew letter. And I'll try to pronounce those letters as we begin to read them. But starting in verse 1 of Lamentations chapter 3, we have Aleph. I am the one who has seen the afflictions that come from the rod of the Lord's anger. He has led me into darkness, shutting out all light. He has turned his hand against me again all day long. Bet. He has made my skin and flesh grow old. He has broken my bones. He has besieged and surrounded me with anguish and distress. He has buried me in a dark place, like those long dead. Gamal. He has walled me in, and I cannot escape. He has bound me in heavy chains, and although I cry and shout, he has shut out all of my prayers. He has blocked my way with a high stone wall. He has made my road crooked. Dalat. He is hidden like a bear or a lion, waiting to attack me. He's dragged me off the path. He's torn me into pieces, leaving me helpless and devastated. He has drawn his bow and made me the target for his arrows. Hey, he has shot me with his arrows deep into my heart. My own people laugh at me. All day they sing their mocking songs. He has filled me with bitterness and given me a bitter cup of sorrow to drink. Vav. He has made me chew on gravel. He has rolled me in the dust. Peace has been stripped away, and I have forgotten what prosperity is. I cry out, my splendor is gone. Everything I had hoped for from the Lord is lost. The author of Lamentations, usually thought to be the prophet Jeremiah, the Weeping Project, is expressing with every bit of creativity and poetry that he can muster the utter hopelessness of the situation that he finds himself in. Taylor Swift, in her very worst breakup song, has not brought the creativity to her grief that the prophet Jeremiah does here. By the way, can you imagine the album after her first divorce? I mean, hell hath no fury, if you know what I mean. But all joking aside, the fall of Jerusalem, if you haven't been here or you don't know, or maybe you weren't paying attention, was a total and utter destruction, a genocide, a psychological war of terror designed by the Babylonians to kill hopelessness, to kill hope in any country that would ever come against them. After 18 months, they had cut off the water and food and starvation and disease. The bodies from the starved people piled up so high that disease and plague ran throughout the city. It said that it was so bad in one of the earlier chapters that women resorted to eating their own children. This is a devastating situation. And when they finally breached the walls after 18 months, it was a bloodbath, mass slaughter of man, woman, and child, and they made sure that it was complete. But they saved the worst for the vassal king that they had put in place who allowed and led this rebellion. And seeing King Zedekiah, who tried to escape, when they found him, they dragged him back and executed every single family member he had in front of them, and then gouged out his eyes, ensuring that it's the last thing he would ever see. And instead of putting him out of his misery, they threw him into a dungeon to live out the rest of his life in darkness and isolation, remembering the consequences of his actions. This is psychological warfare on a level that no one has ever seen before or since. The rest of the people were marched off. Many of them never made it to slavery. Most of them died along the way. And it's after this that the prophet Jeremiah says, listen, We are in utter hopelessness. But just in case someone said that we have hope that someday God will restore us, he'll bring us back to the city of David, they made sure that they tore down stone by stone, not only the temple, but burning every single house and even sending the army to tear down the walls. We see later they do rebuild the walls in Nehemiah, but the giant walls that kept out the Babylonians for 18 months were torn down stone by stone, and then they burned them, and you could still go to archaeological ruins in Jerusalem and see the burn marks on those stones. The devastation was total. The brutality was complete. Hopelessness. You know, when we think of hell, we usually think of fire and smoke and maybe a little bit of Dante's Inferno along the way. And I tried a couple of years ago when I was on a vacation in Italy to read through Dante's Inferno. If you don't know, it's a poem about hell, and it's in, there's modern translations. I could not get through it because it's mostly a political satire. He's mostly taking shots at popes and various people that he doesn't like along the way. But one thing he gets straight. He says, across the top of the door to hell are these words, abandon hope, everyone who enters here. God's all-encompassing love is around us. We are like fish in water who don't know that water exists. God is around us all this time. You have been created for one purpose and one purpose alone, for God to love you. He created you to love you. And even if you don't accept that love, you have no idea that it's still a part of your daily existence. And someone has described hell as simply this: removal from that daily love and understanding that you will never experience it again. Utter hopelessness. Utter hopelessness. That's why C.S. Lewis says in his book, The Problem of Pain, the doors of hell are locked from the inside. And if you've ever felt utter hopelessness, maybe you can sense just a little bit of what it's like to walk through hell on earth. Just a little piece of that. Several years ago, I had taken a couple of pastors down and we were explaining to them what we do when we build houses for family. If you haven't followed us on social media, you should. People living in absolute squalor, in absolute, literally just lean-tos built out of other people's trash. And we build them a very modest 450 square foot home. But it is life-changing for them on a level that if you move from an apartment to a beautiful spot out in the McMansions of the suburbs, it wouldn't be as big a change as it is for these people. And as we were visiting a particular family, when we got there, my brother-in-law Carl was with us. He set up this visit, and my brother-in-law Carl wasn't always a detail guy. So when we got there, this beautiful family, a dad and his 4 kids and his wife, but when we got there, we realized they didn't speak a word of English, and no one with us spoke much Spanish. Like I can order tacos with just, excellence. You can't imagine. But as we tried to talk with them, we couldn't. And so the guy was very animated, though. The dad, he was trying to explain to us, and he got out this book with writing in it, and he was pointing to page after page after page as we kept explaining to him, hablo español no bueno. He did what you do sometimes. He just got louder, And so he was explaining it, and then at some point he started making this motion along the way. And I thought, we need to hear whatever he's saying. So I recorded it and sent it to a friend of mine. And she got back to me the next day. And she says, you have no idea what he was talking about? And I said, none. He said he was describing a time in his life where he was absolutely helpless. He had had 4 kids. He was working 70 hours a week, grueling work in the fields. He said, but he can't even provide for his children. Not one of them even had a bed. They were sleeping on just cardboard on the mud in just some sticks and plastic surrounding them. And when it would rain, he would wake up to his children laying there in the mud. And he finally decided my family would be better off without me. So he went to the security guard at his work and said, we have some varmints that are bothering us. I need to borrow your gun. And on Saturday morning, planning to take his life on Saturday night, he wrote in that book that he was showing us, he wrote a note to every single one of his children, his wife, and his brother about why he took his life and his plans for them and hoping that they would be better off without him. He said, but Saturday afternoon came, and unbeknownst to him, his wife had applied for a house with us. Now, I'm not privy to all that process. We have local lawyers that help us to make sure paperwork is in place, that we're making a good investment in those places. But he thought, maybe I'll just put it off a little bit. And during that week, a month later, when our team came, just sharing the love of Jesus, some of them speaking English loudly that he couldn't understand, but with giant smiles, God absolutely changed his life. And he was telling us, we have hope. Look around. Look at everything that we have, that God has given us. And I realized that God had not forgotten us. He said, but in my place of despair, I was completely hopeless. I was beyond. And I've dealt with people through our work in schools with something, if you're an educator, you know this term, ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. And when we look at people that have gone through extreme trauma, it affects the rest of their lives in incredible ways. People that have gone through sexual abuse or mental abuse or abandonment or social abuse, all of those kind of things, in their 40s, 50s, and 60s are more likely to have heart disease and high blood pressure, even Alzheimer's disease. In other words, not only is the emotion strong in us, but as the famous book said, the body keeps the score. The stress, the trauma, it gets to us, and it is not something that, like when I was a kid, it just say, find the victory of Jesus. You know what? Coming to an altar is a start where God can help you. But God has a healing process that he takes us through. And it involves people around us. Sometimes it involves people that mentor us, that help us in various ways. It involves so many pieces of the puzzle, because sometimes we find ourselves in the kind of buried place where it feels like we're all alone. And unlike the prophet Jeremiah, we keep it to ourselves. And God says that's not the way. Listen, I have chosen a high-stress life. Pastor Troy has chosen a high-stress life. There's a great book that my wife is reading right now by Samuel Chan called Leadership Pain, The Classroom for Growth. I don't know a pastor who hasn't read it. And he says in it, pain, if you're not hurting, you're not leading. Your vision for the future has to be big enough to propel you to face the heartaches and struggles you'll find along the way. In other words, I may not have gone through incredible trauma as a child, but I have chosen trauma as an adult. There is no escaping. Think about this. You come into this world as a bloody mess in an operating room somewhere, and you will leave most likely in pain and agony, and everything in between is a struggle. We have moments of relative peace in our life, and we thank God for them. But if you haven't embraced the idea that life is difficult, that this is not your home, this is not the mansion over a hilltop, then you will be disappointed with most of your life all the time. As a leader, betrayal is a constant companion. Being misunderstood, having actions attributed to the worst possible intentions, harsh criticism. All of this is difficult. And like all leaders, I've experienced all of that. Add to that the stress of a family. My 23-year-old son is with us here today, and he is profoundly autistic. And he is doing amazing. But he is with us today because he cannot be left alone someplace else. And the relentless duty of that has been difficult. We all carry this weight and we all try to manage, but in 2018, I felt like the hits were coming at me so fast and furious that I might not, for the first time in my life, be able to take it. We had several family health situations. I had a sister-in-law who was dying of cancer. I had another sister-in-law who was bleeding to death in the hospital at one point. I had 3 brothers that were all in difficult circumstances, not only because of that, but my third brother, who didn't have one of those wives, was in distress, was hit by a car doing 45 miles per hour and broke the windshield with his face and did brain damage. Woke up in a CT machine screaming. We had an immediate health crisis in my family among my children. Things were difficult. Add to that, most of my best friends were coming to grips with incredible trauma that they had faced as children, and it involved ministry situations that involved lawsuits, and eventually one of the greatest spiritual influences in my life, a man that I would not be standing here if it weren't for him, took his own life as he succumbed to his depression. Going to bed at night was like facing a gauntlet. I couldn't sleep, but when I could, I would have nightmares of my friend's suicide. I didn't know what I was going to do. For the first time in my life, I went to a therapist, and he said, after talking to me a couple sessions, he said, you're doing all of the things that I would tell you to do. There's only two things at this point, rest and time. But those were not an option. Rest was impossible for me to find, even if I wasn't doing anything. And I had hundreds of people counting on me, let alone 5 or 15 staff members. I also had 3 giant building projects going on, which is why the leadership book I will never write is going to be called Don't Do 3 Giant Building Projects at a Time. And I've joked the first 100 pages will be blank, and on page 101 it'll say it's not a metaphor. Don't do 3 building projects at one time, and then the rest of the pages will just be blank after that. But there was no stepping away. Like the prophet Jeremiah, there was no rest. There was no way out of it. And to make matters worse, after my friend took his life, dozens of people I cared about blamed me for his death because I was unable to help him. We find ourselves in places sometimes, like Jeremiah, where we just say, I don't know what I'm going to do. I wasn't suicidal, but it seemed like things would never get better. Have you ever been in a place in your life where you feel like the best is now behind me? My memories are most certainly brighter than my future. My dreams are dark, and the memories of the good times hurt more than there's something that I can appreciate at those times. If being not okay is okay, then I was in good company. Moses suffered with the effects of leadership. His anger and depression caused him to lose control. He said to God, I can't carry all these people by myself. The load is far too heavy. And if this is how you intend to treat me, just go ahead and kill me. Do me a favor, spare me the misery. Job's grief caused him to lose all peace. He said, I have no peace, no quietus, no rest, only turmoil. Jonah was so depressed that he'd helped the enemies of the Jews repent. He wanted to die. He said, now, Lord, take away my life, for it's better for me to die than to live. Jeremiah, in the book of Jeremiah, says this, cursed be the day I was born. Why did I ever come out of my mother's womb to see the trouble and sorrow and end my days in shame? David lived a life of near constant threat. And he cries out, O God, my rock, why have you forgotten me? Why must I wander in grief, oppressed by my enemies? Their taunts break my bones. They scoff, where is the God of yours? Why am I discouraged? Why is my heart so sad? Have you ever prayed to God and felt like I can really relate when people feel like there is no God? Because right now, all I feel is silence. I'm a pilot. I fly a small plane around. We take it into Mexico, land in the dirt sometimes. And a couple months ago, I was taking my daughter, who is way up on the coast in Humboldt County, going to school. It's a long drive, but it's not that long of a flight. But it was a hot day, and as you go over the mountains, lots and lots of bumps. Now, I don't know if you enjoy turbulence in an airplane, but I do not. And when I'm the pilot of that airplane, I enjoy it even less. And after I picked her up and I was bringing her back, got to a point as we were coming out of the mountains where especially it's like a ramp with the air coming up, where we were raising and dropping hundreds of feet at a time. And I remember at one point I said, boy, this is a little bit difficult. Man, this is really something, huh? And I looked back and she was asleep. So much so I took a picture of it. I thought, thanks for the support. And I thought, for the first time, I can relate to the disciples who are in the boat with the waves, and they're going down, and they're bailing water, and Jesus is just taking a nap. And they go, don't you care? We're going to die. Somebody said, well, I guess your daughter really trusts you. And I said, you have a really nice outlook on life. But Jesus would feel the same way that his disciples. In the garden, he prayed. He understood what would happen to him. And he begged for mercy. He knew that the time was coming soon where he would not only be beaten with an inch of his life, every single one of his friends except for one would abandon him. And the people he came to save would cheer for his execution. He knew that in the last moments he would be utterly abandoned by God, and for the first person in human history ever before or since to feel an utter lack of God's presence as he carried the shame of every rapist, child molester, and murderer in history before him and after him. And he cried out the song that he learned in his youth, my God, why have you abandoned me? It says that he cried out to God and said, my soul is crushed with grief to the point of death. Even Jesus felt that kind of depression. And he said to his friends, stay here and watch with me. And it says he went out with his disciples to the usual place to pray in the Mount of Olives. And when he got there, he warned his disciples, pray so you won't fall into temptation. He went a little further to be alone. He got on his knees and he prayed, Father, if it is possible to not have to endure what's coming, please help me avoid it. But if it's what you have for me, I want to do it your way, not mine. It says God sent an angel to encourage him and give him strength, but he was in incredible anguish even after the angel arrived, and he prayed even more intensely, and his sweat turned like blood as it dripped from him. This is a real condition that people experience under incredible stress. Jesus, the abundant life giver, felt the crushing weight of grief so heavy that he said it would kill him. The same Jesus who told us, don't be anxious about tomorrow, looked at his tomorrow and was crushed with anxiety. That's how you know when the Bible says don't worry, when Jesus says don't worry, when it says cast all your cares on him, that the Bible is not warning you about a prohibition to not sin. It is encouraging you that there is peace beyond an understanding, that there's something else that God has for you. It is an encouragement, not a condemnation. That God says, listen, you can do this. I have a place of peace for you. And Jesus knew that Friday's torment would become Sunday's triumph, that despair of the night of the garden would defeat the darkness for all eternity. And in Lamatations, the prophet, in the depth of his hopelessness, defiantly dares to hope when he remembers something. Listen, when you find yourself in that place of despair, remember that your future may look dim, but God has been lighting up your past. And it says this, Zarin, the thought of my suffering and hopelessness is bitter beyond words. I will never forget this awful time as I grieve my loss. Yet, I still dare to hope. When I remember this, the faithful love of the Lord never ends. His mercies never cease. Great is his faithfulness. His mercies begin afresh every morning. I will say to myself, the Lord is my inheritance. Therefore, I will hope in him. God is good to those who depend on him, those who search for him. So it is good to wait quietly for the patience of the Lord. When you pray and you say, God, I can't take this anymore, and it feels like silence is so loud it's echoing from heaven, that is not the silence of God. That is God saying, wait, because you can't handle what I have to say right now. Words would fail you if I were to give them to you. Ever be in just such a horrible place, and you got a friend that says, hey, I'm going to fix this for you. Wives, you felt this from your husband. You say, my day was horrible. They say, well, what you got to do is this. God doesn't do that. He listens. And what sounds like silence is the listening of God as he says, just keep talking because salvation comes to those who wait on me. The walls would be rebuilt. The temple would be rebuilt. The people of God would rejoin the place of their home. What Jeremiah sees as impossible, but he dares to defiantly hope that maybe there's just a future I cannot see. He was right even though he might not have even believed the words that he was saying himself. And some of us, we got to realize sometimes in our darkest hour to get a little defiant and say, you know what? They can laugh at me. They can scoff. People can call me a little unrealistic. But I am going to decide to defiantly hope. Elisha, Job, Moses, David, Jeremiah, Jonah, and Jesus had honest conversations with God. I had a friend in my worst time. She had fallen away from her faith. And she said to me, hey, Jeff, I admire that you're still struggling with this. She said, can I ask you a question? Because I've given up. Do you still pray? And I said to her, I listen. I don't talk much. Because I'm afraid the words I say to God might hurt our relationship permanently. I was joking, but I was not talking to God much. And I was wrong. An entire book of the Bible exists for you and me for one purpose: to let you know God can take it. He is ready to hear your heart, no matter how dark a place you find your heart in. He's ready. I wanted to be strong. I wasn't. Jesus was strong when he was honest with God and said, I'll still face it. Listen, sometimes God sets us straight, see Job. Sometimes he sends a raven with lunch, see Elijah. Sometimes he sends an angel to strengthen us while we're sweating blood. C.S. Lewis says in his book, Letters to Malcolm, chiefly on prayer, some people feel guilty about their anxieties and regard them as a defect of faith. I don't agree at all. They're afflictions, not sins. Like all afflictions, they are, if we can so take them, our share in the passion of Christ. And I'll end with this story. A few years ago, my son, who has been incredibly healthy throughout his life, after early in his life having lots of medical difficulties, he's been strong as an ox. You'll meet him today. He's my height. He's huge. He's strong. He's awesome. But we got to the point where he needed his wisdom teeth out. And at the time, he couldn't even go to the dentist at all. We would have to have him put out under anesthesia just to have his teeth cleaned. So the day came where we dropped him off in the hospital, and he was not very thrilled about what was going on. As they wheeled him away and we said goodbye to him, we prayed. He freaked out. We weren't there, but he got off the table. They had to put him under a sedative, strap him back down to the table. Things were horrible. When he came out of that surgery, it was just one of the saddest things I'd ever seen. And I thought, what have we done? This poor kid has no understanding that we put him under the knife for his own good. How will he ever trust us again? From his surgery, so much blood was going down, he was vomiting blood when he came back. He was in unbelievable pain as he came back to consciousness. And I just thought, we will drive by a hospital the rest of our life. We go near a dentist the rest of our life. He will never trust us. But something happened instead. All he wanted was a little bit of comfort and a little bit of understanding from us, even though he could not understand and will probably never understand why he had to go through that pain. If we'd continued to let the wisdom teeth grow, the pain would have been so much worse. Everything would have been so much difficult. We could have put it off, but for the love of our son, we let him walk through some pain that was going to serve him so much more later in a way that he will never understand until eternity comes. And I don't need to apply that for you. We hope because we remember his mercy doesn't quit. He has an inheritance for us. And we wait. because we know salvation only comes from the Lord. Let's talk. We carry each other's burdens. Let's pray. Tell it to God. He can take it. Let's heal. Because healing is found in the hope, and hope is defiant. Would you bow your heads with me?